good way to start. Okay, so Luke Stray, I don't know Luke Stray, no control, no constraint, just us. I am very pleased to be here to speak with you today, and I'm thankful for your patience in waiting 5-10 minutes because of the traffic, etc. Thank you for the warm introduction, and special thanks to the Centre for Khmer Studies and Human Science Encounters Phnom-Penh. I'd also like to thank Deakin University, who's presenting from research that they've done as part of my doctorate. And I have to acknowledge World Vision, who provided funding for the data collection. I'm going to talk about 2 reintegrative pathways today. I'm not comfortable with this microphone yet. Can you bear with me for half a moment? Take it. Good. That's much better. Thank you. Okay. So 2 reintegrative pathways, and let me just run through the main. Well, maybe why I'm here might be a good start. I'm a youth worker. Well, I was a youth worker in Melbourne, Australia. As a volunteer, I came here with my wife, without whose support, this wouldn't have been completed. So, as volunteers, we came to Cambodia and became involved in researching youth issues, etc., violence, etc. So we came in 2002. We've been here on and off since then, off at the moment. We're presently in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where I'm supporting Sarah, who's the main breadwinner. I've got 3 children who I look after, and I try and write from this dissertation at the moment. Let me summarise what I want to talk about today, and I'm going to try and keep it to around 40 minutes to allow time for questions afterwards. That's my aim, okay? The first main thing I want to point out is that our ideas of what reintegration is can actually distract us from what's going on in social reality. They can actually affect our programs. Our ideas of reintegration actually guide our programs, right? So this presentation is going to focus on what's actually happening according to the data, and then we can then think from that about how that should influence our programs. So, in fancy words, we can talk about procedural and substantive elements of reintegration. Basically, I'm going to tell you today that there are 2 parts to reintegration. So on the one hand, sometimes we might say, I reintegrated her back to Kampong Spoo last week, yeah? When the protection worker says, I reintegrated her, they didn't really, we know what they mean, right? We provided some assistance which helped them be placed in a certain location. That was the provision of assistance. Whether or not she's actually integrated into that social community, that family, that village, is a whole other different thing, right? So when we speak of reintegration, we've got procedural conceptions of reintegration over here, and we've got substantive elements of reintegration over here. Procedural, what we do. Substantive, what happens in social reality. What are the mechanisms? What social groups? We're talking about integrating somewhere, right? What social groups are relevant to integration for different types of people? What cultural norms? What social norms? Getting these 2 things separate is the start of getting our programming straight. So, I think I've elaborated on that enough. Now I'm going to... The main point, there's a few points along the way, but the main point is you've got very different ways that social integration happens in social life within modern, urban, individualistic social milieu. And you've got very different ways that social integration happens within traditional, rural, collectivistic social milieu. This isn't really that complicated. It's kind of obvious. In the city, where people are influenced by education and modern values, rights, where we are individuals. We are trained to be individuals, and we integrate with each other on the basis of respect and our individuality. Within traditional environments, integration occurs around social roles, right? Within a social hierarchy. So, playing your role correctly within a very traditional environment is key to social integration. So, I'm talking about 2 pathways to social integration. Now, that was like going really fast, right? Right to the main point. I'm going to now take you through it and the data and the process to try and sort of show you how I've got to these claims. This is the overall outline. And please, any questions, please jot them down. You'll have time at the end. If not at the end, I'd love any of you who'd like to talk about it more to come to FCC, which is where I'll be after 7:30. So context. And why am I talking about the reintegration of sexualized Cambodian women? Nobody talks about sexualized Cambodian women. We talk about them being trafficked, right? Or sexually exploited or raped or, you know, we're using these other terms. Why am I using the word sexualized? Okay, what you're seeing at the moment is actually data from a Johns Hopkins study undertaken in 2008, qualitative study in groups where, in shelters where the assistance is being provided. And they've described their problems, which were listed out, and I've just copied them, pasted them, literally put them into Wordle. So all of the qualitative data is shown before you. So what you can see up there is the main problems they face. Now there's one line really that stood out for me in that report. And the line said something like, I paraphrase, the effect of being rejected in everyday life, the ongoing effects of social rejection was at least as injurious, if not more injurious, than any of the sexual violence that they'd experienced. I'll say it again, it was not about the sex, it was about the rejection. So why am I calling them sexualized young women? The problem is they're being rejected and socially marginalized on the basis of past sexual behaviour. More fundamental than the particular type of abuse experienced is the fact that it's a deviation from being a good Cambodian woman, and it's affecting the way people are then treating them in communities. Now, I can see practitioners in the room. This is nothing new. This is really nothing new. Okay.
Luke,
yes.
can you hold the microphone a little bit further away?
Can everyone hear me like this?
Yeah. It might be better.
I would prefer it because it's kind of distracting me too. Perfect. Okay. I like this definition of reintegration. There are a range of definitions around, and people who define reintegration are often also talking about how assistance should be provided. This definition actually keeps separate the provision of assistance and the idea of social integration. See here, reintegration tells us that it's about processes of inclusion and rebuilding of relationships. This comes from the Asian Foundation report in about 2005. It was repeated in the Long Way Home, the Hagar World Vision report in 2008. It's cited in a lot of places. There are other definitions out there. I'm putting this up because it's actually pretty good. It doesn't tell you how the rebuilding of relationships occur. It's saying reintegration is relational. It's not telling you how still. I'm wanting to talk about how today. But then what I like is that it separates this from reintegration assistance. So we have the two definitions. This is reintegration, which is an ideal aim or a goal. And we have reintegration assistance, which is the stuff we would like to give people and the services and the support that is going to help them get there, we hope. Big difference between the two. Important to keep the distinction. So, what was the research question that I was approaching? How do young Khmer women who have experienced sexual violence, so this included sex trafficking and rape and sexual abuse, and who have spent time in residential care or shelter care,
how do they construct ideas related to reintegration? Who, what are the people, processes and mechanisms important to achieving this success? And then amongst these groups and institutions, how are these ideas constructed and practiced? Now, why was I interested in this? Well, as a practitioner, as an advisor who's aiming to give resources and support and research assistance to groups who are doing reintegration work, they're providing reintegration assistance. As an advisor, I didn't know what reintegration was. It wasn't very clear to me. And if it's not clear to me and I'm supposed to be giving advice to other people, so there's a problem, right? So thanks for the opportunity to do this research and the support I had to do that. And I've stepped out of the field to do this. So, learning from young women themselves and also the other people who they think are important to how social integration occurs. Now, the methodology I've used is called grounded theory methodology. This means, and it's a good methodology for me, right, because I had no idea. I didn't have a theory of how reintegration happened. I was just confused by it. Yeah? So, instead of starting with a hypothesis and then seeking to test it, disprove it, prove it, instead I've started with a question or a series of questions, right, related to what is this thing we're talking about, and then from there, gone between empirical data and theory, empirical data theory, to build up a grounded theory of reintegration. So this particular methodology dates back to the 1960s. I'm following sort of Corbin and Strauss's take on this and a lady called Kathy Sharma's. So this is the methodology. I'm not going to labour on the process because I want to get to the findings and the implications for practice, right? But it's all there in the dissertation that's freely available online. If you'd like the details of the ethics review process in Australia, in Cambodia, and all of the work that was done to sort of get it in play. What I will say is that this research was supported by 4 organisations who I'm very thankful to, who were identified. I was given a list of 8 organisations by the National Committee on Anti-Trafficking. They said, these are the top 8 who are doing the best work on reintegration. So from that top 8, I have got 4 to participate. I'm not saying if any said yes or any said no, because that list, someone might remember it. Anyway, these groups are anonymous. And the participation was anonymous to allow for the protection of their reputation in case anything terrible came out, or, you know, this is my way of protecting the groups who were involved. And I've been very thankful for the opportunity to meet with representatives of some of those groups yesterday, and I've got more meetings tomorrow talking about the implications. So it's important to me, the field. You know, this is the interesting thing for me. I also just want to emphasise here the role of the female translator. And part of the reason why I'm making you wait is because Sophia was going to be here tonight. Saying Sophia, without whom this research would not have happened, who I'm hugely in debt to, because she's such a good person who really gave of her life over 20 months while I did the data collection. So as a male, as an Australian male, as a foreigner with average Khmer skills, this information would have been completely inaccessible to me without Sophia, who, you know, was absolutely incredible. So I'm sorry she's not here. I'm worried she couldn't find it, but she was coming. But yeah, I will keep moving. But thanks, Sophia. So, what are the limitations of this research? Well, just keep in mind that everything I say, I am talking about this top group of well-funded organisations, right? So I'm talking about the ones who are identified as doing good work and who are relatively more resourced than other groups. So when I'm talking about the provision of services, etc., I'm not describing the average experiences of children in orphanages or there's a lot of shelters. There's at least 100-200 shelters, and orphanages, there's hundreds and hundreds, right? This is not reflective. I'm not documenting what's happening for everyone. I'm contributing to an understanding of success and what we should be aiming for with people who are trafficked, with people from these orphanages, institutions as well. What is it that we're aiming for if we're giving them institutional care? What's after that? These are questions that really need answers. So, that's the limitation, and this theory model would benefit from testing in the field to develop indicators that go with the benchmarks that I've identified. So, the qualitative interviews were undertaken, and there were 53 in total. So, you know, the average of about 80, 85 minutes each interview. Hours and hours and hours, and reams and reams and reams of paper. The Cambodian young women who participated were between 18 and 25, that experienced trafficking and sexual abuse, had spent time in residential care, and they'd been identified as successfully reintegrated. So the organisations who participated gave me a list of 200 who were successfully reintegrated, and I randomly got to these through that process. In addition, they identified types of people, like family members, friends, etc., people in the village chiefs. You know, they identified a group of people who they said were important to their integration. So these 28 people were interviewed as well. Not the exact people. They said people liked them. Okay. This is the particular information about the women who participated. I'm not going to labour it. I just want to point out I'm interviewing them when they're about 21. Their experiences of abuse and exploitation are averaging around the age of 15. So when I'm speaking with them, they have had approximately 30 months of time back in a village or in a new community, and they've also had about 22 months of time in a residential care institution or a shelter. So they are looking back. These women are giving us their perspectives of care as youth and children. This is important because they have time to reflect. And I'm not pressing them on the details of the difficulties they experienced. I'm learning from them about their experiences of integration. Now, this research compared their ideals and ideas of reintegration with their experiences. You know, when I ask you what is successful reintegration, you come up with a bunch of things, right? Things come into your mind. It might be related to your job, your family. It might be related to, because we all are seeking to integrate somewhere. Okay, now, I'm not sure if you can see it. It's actually a bit difficult to see all the way back there. But let me just emphasize these four ones in the middle are sort of the most predominant. They were all, so during their interviews, a lot of emphasis was given to having a job. When I'm asking about successful reintegration, a lot of emphasis, getting a job. Finishing my studies, the skills and education. So whether that is TAFE, university, sewing, skills and education, critical. A lot of emphasis was on wife and family and acceptance. Now, I'm not going to go through and read them all for you. I'm sorry, that will bore you to tears, but it is hard to see. But there's a whole lot of different sort of nodes or conceptions of reintegration here. What I want to communicate, though, is that the most important one to come through was this idea of acceptance. Because it was not only mentioned, it was in the top four that was mentioned, it was also mentioned the most frequently. And it was also mentioned as a precursor or as a foundation to achieving the others. If you want to have family, you need to be accepted by the family. If you want a job, you must be accepted as a candidate, as an interviewee. Acceptance comes before everything. Acceptance emerged as the most important category. I want to deepen our thinking around acceptance today, but let's start there. Acceptance was the key for understanding this. Okay. Now, everything going on in between them, these are just things you can do within in vivo software with qualitative data these days. You can compare nodes, what was coded under here with what was coded under there, and you can test the levels of association or levels of word similarity to see how it all links together. And it creates some very interesting results. For example, these circles, these nodes or ideas, just displayed by word similarity cluster. I want to point to a few clusters here. Here, these ideas of success were important to everyone, wherever they went, whether they went to a rural or an urban centre. Being accepted, having your health and basic safety needs met, having family or being a wife within that family or a good daughter. I included both under the one category. Employment, skills and education. These things were universally important wherever people were going. However, you see some other groups that show differences, interesting differences, right? These ideas of reintegration, conformity with traditional ideals, comportment, the way you walk and talk, sexuality, your sexual reputation. These ideas reflect understandings of what success looks like in a traditional collectivistic place for a woman. These other group up here, sort of independence, identity, individual identity, cognition, affect modulation, that's processes of thinking well and being self-aware of your emotions, and empowerment. So these categories are ideas of reintegrative success that came through in the interviews. These look more related to the skills you need to survive in a modern, urban, individualistic environment. So finally, we have one more group up here, which is related to ending migration and reintegration. What is successful reintegration? It's a goal to be measured. What does this mean, right? Remember, I'm interviewing people important. 16 of the people interviewed who were considered important were protection staff, residential staff members and social workers and things. When you say, what is successful reintegration? They say, well, it's the goal, it's our aim, it's what we want to be able to measure. And they also, some of them would say, well, successful reintegration, it's about ending unsafe migration. When they're in the one place, right, we know that they're successful, they haven't moved, right? This is the challenge of demonstrating reintegrative success. So these ideas are obviously, they come from practitioners, and they also reflect procedural understandings. They reflect the ideas of reintegration as an intervention. They don't reflect ideas of reintegration as an achievement in social life. So, in sum, I want to talk about three main areas that came through the data. Ideas of successful integration as related to being a traditional achievement within a collectivist, village, rural community. On the other hand, there are ideas around integration that appeared related to a modern, urban, individualistic community. And the other ideas of integration were procedural, bureaucratic. They're about the delivery of assistance. So, how is reintegration constructed? Well, I'm talking about these three main ways that were evident through the data. Let me talk about the traditional first. And I'm going to come back to the bureaucratic. The bureaucratic ideas are, well, we provide assistance, but what's our aim? You know, and there are competing ideas for what our aim is, which come through under these sort of ideas. Okay, so what the data indicated was that successful traditional reintegration, keep an eye on the time, was related to the fulfillment of traditional role. Within a Cambodian village environment, right, you have a social hierarchy. You play your role within the social hierarchy to fit in. That's what happens in a collectivist community. And for women, and for these young women in their particular age and stage of life, there's a lot of emphasis upon proper sexuality. They're supposed to be virginal at that age, before marriage. They're supposed to have proper comportment, supposed to walk and talk in ways that are appropriate for a Khmer girl of a certain age. And they're supposed to be industrious. They're supposed to be able to, you know, manage the household in a thrifty way, make a bit of money, earn money on the side if you can, you know. Within traditional villages, it's also good if you can earn money close to home. Then you don't have any risk to your reputation, right? You don't have to go a long way. You can do it close from home. So, reintegration happens in places. It happens in families, and it happens in the village. Within the family, if the girl is able to fulfill, to perform within her social role, then she can be affirmed and loved for this in that traditional environment. She can also, critically, be honoured. She honours others who are older or more experienced or whatever, you know, and they in turn honour her for her performance of role. Traditional roles, integration through your traditional role within village community. Okay, reintegration in a traditional environment. Alternatively, within a modern, urban, individualistic environment, more like Phnom-Penh, you have integration, again, within social institutions. Integration happens in places, with groups of people. The most important ones were families and friendships. You know, that's where we can experience love as people, through participating in these relationships. We are affirmed through acceptance or reciprocal recognition, through giving and receiving of love. You are successfully reintegrated in a family if you are loved and you have someone to love there, right? Within the public sphere or in society, on the street, on the road, you know, and this area is emerging in Cambodia, yeah, you have the knowledge of being an equal before the law. Now, while there's a traditional world which might make you lower or higher, or as an equal before the law, you have respect. You have the chance to respect others for their equality and your equality. You can engage with others in a way that affirms your sense of self-respect. Finally, within workplaces or educational institutions, your unique abilities and your talents are put to use, and you may gain esteem. You may be esteemed or recognised or rewarded for your unique contributions. Basically, within the modern world, we have individual identities, right? And it's our role to develop these and to function within social groups and institutions. And we are well integrated into those if we are loved within our personal relationships and families. If we, and from that, we gain a sense of self-confidence. Within the public sphere, we have the opportunity to practice participating in a sphere in which we're all theoretically equal. From that, we can gain self-respect. And within the workplace, we can be esteemed for our unique contributions. And from that, get a sense of our own worth, our self-esteem, right? So, individual identity. Now, what I'm pointing out, maybe some people find it a bit tiring in that it's kind of obvious or something, but keep in mind there's a spectrum. So you've got really traditional places in Cambodia, really collectivistic, and all at the other end, you've got really hyper-individualistic modern places. And these are concepts to talk about life in different places. And we're all somewhere on a spectrum, somewhere, right? They don't really exist. These are ideas that help you understand how we integrate within more traditional or more modern places. I want to talk about the findings and the implications. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this procedural delivery of assistance, the ideas that are guiding the delivery of assistance at the moment. So first of all, I just want to reiterate that social exclusion or rejection is the primary problem amongst this particular population. I also want to point out that reintegration appears to be both substantive, something that happens in real life, and it also appears to be something about the delivery of assistance. Procedural and substantive. And there was another approach that appeared. Let me share something first. I'll just read something to give you an idea of a traditional approach to reintegration, as portrayed by one of the government ministers who was interviewed for the study. Let me just get it. So, I asked Madam Satira, I'm making up her name anyway, right? It's not a real name. I've asked Madam Satira, who's a senior government official delivering services to trafficking victims. I asked her to, in the course of our interview, she said reintegration is about returning to normal life. And so my question was along the lines of, so what do you mean by normal life, you know, and how is this achievable if they're considered spoilt or bad as a result of their sexualization? Her response, and she directed it to my translator. I read her response now. I want to tell him two things. The first thing is that they are sent to the shelter for 1 year, or at least 6 months to 1 year. She has been through the emotional rehabilitation. They live, or they spend their time, by looking at the role models of other victims who can live a normal life, which means she is trained, educated. The second thing is about Khmer culture. Many Khmer women who return home, some get married, some get back to business as usual. Khmer culture is strict. Women are not allowed to go out too much. Living in the shelter is having good education about that. No one would allow women to do that in our culture. So they live as usual with good education in the shelter. So they can listen and understand. But some don't listen. They return to their previous job. We can't say it's 100% successful. For the 1-year follow-up visit, it's also about that issue. We follow up on them. If they have problems and they want to go back to their job, i.e. sex work, we remind them. But we can only do for the women who want to help themselves. If they themselves don't want to be bad people, we ask them to follow us. We are successful. But if they take the left-hand path and want to go back, they will just go. What can we do? We have no right to stop them. It's their right. But do we crack them down? No, we don't crack them down. We crack the brothels down. So, in the course of conversation, I was probing her on what she's saying about honour. She's saying these girls need to have honour in a traditional society, right? I'm probing her. So is that something that she has to have or something the community has to give her? Her response: it's something the community needs to give her because so the experience of abuse or the bad thing, doesn't mean that she wanted that thing to happen to her. She didn't want the abuse. So people around her should look at the reasons behind what happened and accept it. She didn't want it to be that way. Any human being wants to be good, right? I want to say that even if she does choose to do sex work, or sexual relations with anyone, outside of marriage. but it's only because she doesn't have a choice. This is the only reason she did it. So this book, and she's talking about a book about rights here, this book is what we wanted them to understand about victims' rights. We want the world to know, but we can't disseminate to other countries, we want our nation to know that amongst all these victims, none of them want to be criticised. It's none. It's because they don't have a choice. What's the significance of that? Why am I labouring that? From a traditional perspective, we're helping them to regain their traditional role. And the provision of shelter care is about helping them achieve that role. Traditionally speaking, yeah? And this is one of the approaches that informs the delivery of care. Not just at senior official levels, but also within some of the organisations providing help. You've got some people who think more this way, right? And they think this way for a reason. The reason is that traditional life is actually pretty much like that. If we could just get them to play along and be good, and play the right role, then they could be included. So this isn't just because they're conservative trying to keep the culture. They're actually wanting to protect the girls. Protect them by helping them to become more traditional so they can be accepted and included back in. Yeah. Now, that's one way that informs the delivery of assistance. There's another sort of, and this is what comes through policies and rights and conventions related to reintegration. This is a more modern, sort of legal, juridicially led idea of reintegration. In legal discourse, traditional legal discourse, we assume that the individual is free, born free, right? Our negative rights protect us from external interference by the state or others. Our positive rights help us to pick up and enjoy that, and forms of compensation. These things help us to then realise our freedom. But the problem is, when they're being removed from sexual exploitation, brothels, etc., they're not free, even when they're removed, right? That's why there's such intensive provision of services. They still need a lot of help, right? Why? So, there's some positives to this. There was another approach that I came across in the shelters related to the provision of assistance. This isn't formalised in legal policy. This isn't captured in traditional codes of conduct like the Chabab Strait. This is an approach that is embodied and performed. This approach basically means that when a girl is rejected and brutalised and hurt, and she goes to a shelter, at the shelter, she has someone who opens the door to her and says, "You're welcome here. You're accepted for your rights, for who you are. You have unique skills and abilities that are worthwhile. We want to invest in you. We think you can be something." This is awesome stuff, right? This is particularly awesome stuff in a modern, urban, individualistic environment, right? This is the basis of how we get our identity, how we come to play our roles with confidence in the world, in a more modern, individualistic world. The challenge, of course, is that when people come from traditional collectivistic rural environments over here, and they come to the shelter, and we welcome them in, we don't honour them on behalf of their role, not their traditional role. We show them respect, and we show them love, and we show them esteem on the basis of modern values that inform our work. This is professional, social work-driven stuff, you know, this is the basics. We want them to have personal autonomy, develop themselves. The challenge, of course, is that after you've given them all of that, you can't then send them back and expect to be satisfied with being honoured for their traditional roles. So it's complicated. So, we're good, you know, in some of these well-funded places that I've seen, you know, we are good at empowering people in this modern sense. And it's a part of us, it's who we are, and we're training people who come and work with us to be this way. You know, these modern values are influencing what we're doing. These modern values, we celebrate and love and cherish them, and they're good in rights mainstreaming and gender mainstreaming, activities that aim to change the country broadly. Many people support these ideas and their dissemination. However, when we are helping an individual, these ideas can do damage in one individual's life, right? We can do damage unintentionally. My take on it is that if she's got nothing to go back to because she's not accepted, she's rejected, she's got nothing, there's no honour, there's no love, she's a bad girl and she's vulnerable to more abuse, if that's her situation, absolutely, embrace her, accept her, bring her in, provide her care, in full knowledge that the care you're providing is preparing her for life in the modern world. Through support, through the right kind of support, she can develop the right emotional reflexivity to be able to return to the traditional environment for a short time, play her role for a short time. She's role-playing. You know, she knows I'm being a good girl, staying with mum and dad. I can do this for about 2 days, but by the time I have to go home, I'm looking forward to going home to be myself again, to be free, to see my friends who recognize and acknowledge me, and, you know, we're good at that. We're good at that, which is something. I've talked about 2 reintegrative pathways today. The first one, let's talk about modern. First one in modern life, it really lines up with a social philosopher called Axel Honneth, a German social philosopher. And basically, modern integration within modern social life in Cambodia looks a lot like integration within modern individualistic societies more generally. These ideas are influencing social relations, not in full, but in part. The other, more traditional pathway, it reflects, it sort of draws on work done by Judy Ledgerwood. It reflects, she's theorised how traditional societies work, what a successful traditional woman looks like. People, you know, I won't get into that debates, but essentially the main message that I'm bringing, and what I've seen in the data, and it resonates with other research that I've drawn on, is that there's sort of 2 general pathways to social integration within modern and within traditional, within individualistic, within collectivistic, within urban, within rural. There's my email. I'm very open to questions now and FCC afterwards, but by email. And again, my appreciation to the non-identified organisations who gave so much over a 20-month period where I drove all over the country to see people wherever they happened to be reintegrated from this list. It was a long process with a lot of support from people doing very, very hard work, because reintegration assistance is very hard to provide. And when I hear people say, I reintegrated 5,000 children from orphanages because I closed them all down, we sent them home. It makes me a bit upset. Okay. That's all for me. Thank you very much.
Time for
Q&A. Please, can I get a seat? And it was snowing where I was coming from, so I'm sorry I'm so wet. It doesn't have to be Q&A.
Well, I came much too late, sorry for that. But I'm wondering, and maybe you told before, then I can ask another person.
Speak up.
But how is the family involved in the reintegration process?
Thank you.
Say the question.
So how is the family involved in the reintegration process? According to all different sort of standards and procedures that are adopted by different organisations. Some organisations make this a big priority, others don't so much. That's the short answer. Yeah. In theory, if we could bring families along a journey, embracing those modern values, right? That's a way to go. That's intensive work. It's really super intensive work, and it might only work for some and not others, depending on the cultural environment. But great question.
Yeah, but I think when you're talking about a traditional way of living and the modern way of living, then you are talking about a culture of Cambodia, and they're making a step forward. So, and even maybe the mothers of the girls who had this experience have the same experience, so maybe they know where to talk about.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're right that there's parts of Cambodia that are very traditional, but there's also parts that are super modern. They whiz by me on motorbikes and pitch my boat sometimes, and we have both ends of the spectrum. So, thanks. Next one.
In terms of the two pathways, have you seen success here in Cambodia, and what does that look like?
Thank you, great question. I didn't see a lot of traditional success. I saw some who were really doing well in a really traditional environment, but there was something there nagging, and that nagging thing was the question of their sexual reputation. Even, one of the girls, she married the perpetrator, who was the husband, became the husband later, obviously. And this was something that, it was a rape case that was taken, but they were lovers, and we did talk about consent all night, but in the end she chose to marry him after going to the shelter, after getting all of this great stuff. But this was the path she chose to go back to the village. And back in the village, she looked successful, right? She had 2 children. She was only all of 19 or 20 or something. It's pretty young to be having children, but her family, she was with her family, she had a husband, she'd been trained to sew things and sell them locally. It looks great, but over the course of like an hour and a half interview, it was even a bit longer, it sort of came out that there's still problems with this other girl who wanted to marry him, and the husband is it's kind of like, is the relationship stable? Is she going to get turfed out again because people still don't think she's good? So, okay, that's traditional. So I didn't see much great traditional success, right? What I did see was some radically transformed girls that were about 6 or 7 who described themselves as reborn or living again, because the experience of being loved and accepted it creates life, right? It rebirths you. And they had that in spades, some of them. Others of them, even more tragic, right, is the ones who had that. They had all this stuff in the shelter. They came to value themselves again. Incredible. But when they got out, there were no social groups or institutions who could reflect that value back to them. The only place they ever found it was in the shelter. And out in real life, nothing. From the mum who ran a casino, the guy who used to be her pimp, and all her cousins and whatever who think of her as a prostitute. She thought she might have a job with them working in bridal industry, but they all treated terribly. So, they need social groups to connect into. You need other people This acceptance in the data looks like mutual recognition in theory. These ideas of mutual recognition, that we recognize each other, and on the basis of that we are able to experience freedom within modern life, right? Next question, please. Sorry, Jay, you want to say something else? Go.
Just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
So from that, does that then give you a better idea of what procedural success looks like to enable that?
Procedural success, what does it look like? Yeah, well, are they loved within families or intimate friendships? Do they have those opportunities? Within the workplace, do they have work? Can they get work? Within the workplace, are they able to be recognised and esteemed for what they're doing? Have they embodied these ideas of rights and self-respect that enable them to feel confident to do their jobs, or to stand next to someone in line, or to whatever, participate as a citizen? So,
Sorry, David was next. Sorry.
And then I'll defer to Sharon. Look, thanks so much for the presentation. What I loved about it was the passion that you brought to it. And it's clearly engaging. Yeah, it's inevitable. It comes with us doing a PhD. But what I love is that the passion persists. So, and that was wonderful to see. I've got a kind of an academic question. And you talked about at the beginning that the participants that you identified had been, or the participants had been identified as successfully reintegrated. And it was this they themselves identified as being successfully reintegrated, or was this the perceptions of the NGOs that they were successfully reintegrated? Because that begs the question a little bit.
great question.
Great question. Everyone is making up reintegration and their ways to assess it. Everyone has a different idea. There are some ideas that are more predominant than others. I think if we're going to set up procedures, we need to take note of what's happening in social reality and design our boxes to fit how it works in social reality.
So, yes, the organisations identified them as successful. I never gave any criteria, because this is the point. I want to find out what other people think. And there were some who I would agree with. Yeah, they were successful. There were others who were so sad. Honestly, some of the cases were really difficult. Yeah.
Please.
So in the study, you've taken your sample from the 4 successful NGOs, but you mentioned there might be as many as 100 different shelters. I wonder if you have any sense of the extent to which the different pathways are being employed, intentionally or otherwise, by the other 96 that you didn't look at. Now, obviously, it goes beyond your data, but it's a big question. What are all the others doing?
Yeah, great question. I get the sense that it's a mishmash, and that's intuition based on time living in country. But I get the sense that we've got traditional ideas informing what we do, we've got modern ideas informing what we do, and they all get washed together in the mix, which is dangerous, as says Sarah, my wife here, who was managing Hagar for a while, and saw the difficulties of reintegration work firsthand.
Thank you very much, Luke, for the very inspiring presentation. I was just wondering, I think the sample for this research was the girls from 7 to 12. Is it right? Sorry, I forgot.
18 to 25.
Sorry.
At the time of interview.
Okay, yeah. But one of the gaps in this region, as you know, is that the intervention towards the male victim is really lacking. So I'm just wondering, maybe during your research, data collection, you probably came up with some of the cases of male victims. And do you really see the pathway of reintegration? Do you see basically similar or?
Great question. I was at a wedding last night with Aya. I was sitting next to a girl who'd done research on integration with people being trafficked for fishing guys. Her name's Kate Day. It was interesting chatting with her because, for guys, I haven't done a lot of work on the traditional things associated with male roles, right? Most of my work has been on the female side. I do have some anyway, her perspective on that when we were chatting is that for men, they don't have any role or any place. If they don't have a family with wealth, then they want to have a family, right? Most want to have a family, but there's no pathway to getting a family if there's no job. If there's no job, there's no way to establish an identity for them at all. So forget trying to provide assistance to them, because as soon as they come, they're gone to the next place to try and get the next job. It's so hard because they're just on the search. So whereas, yeah, that's a comment. Yeah, needs research.
Sorry. So you talked about the importance of having, in the modern setting, having the relationships being built up, and clearly a larger number of relationships are going to help in terms of stability in case people will move on. Did you come across organisations or settings where that was being facilitated by any of the organisations, or things that would help to facilitate that?
Yeah, that's a great question. There were very different approaches amongst some of the organisations. One of them, sort of, their process of providing assistance seemed to go on for a very long time, in that they would just keep following up. Everyone else would do it for 12 or 24, but they would institutionally, their list kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Perhaps not a sustainable, desirable model from a donor's perspective, but from the girl's perspective, at least they had someone coming to see them. Whether that makes for a real sense of community and real integration is another matter. The next answer to your question is that there were 2 faith-based organisations who participated and 2 who weren't faith-based. Now, the faith-based organisations, you are confronted with people who've been rejected and excluded. They don't have anything. There's a tendency to draw on what resources whatever you have to help this person fill their gap, to help them feel accepted and included and special, right? Within the faith-based organisations, typically the people working there had associations with churches and youth groups and whatever. And so for the girls, they would often connect themselves with sort of youth group activities or church activities or something, and they would find connection and a place, and also through social enterprises was critical. Social enterprises, these church sort of youth group kind of things, these provided a means for the continuing attachments with other people, you know. Yeah, that's the main thing. Social enterprises. Some people are doing it really, really well, you know. And that's that's a great thing. If you can get a community around that. And I saw a bit of that, yeah.
Thank you, Luke. You mentioned that social exclusion and rejection seems to be the primary problem. So when we read in the newspapers that a young woman's been raped at the village level, and then she is taken and put into the shelter, are we not saying there is something bad about her when the perpetrator stays in the village? And is that ever challenged?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question, to repeat it, is, this will give me time to think. When a girl has been raped in a village, and typically, I mean, through the research, when she's been raped in a village, and we remove her and put her in a shelter, is that not letting the perpetrator off the hook and blaming her? Okay, that's sort of the question. What I can say is the pathway of these girls to the shelter was typically, these are not victims. This is important, and there's a lot of the research I haven't had time to stress. These are not victims in the sense that we tend to portray them. These were people fighting to be honoured and respected as Khmer women. Let's not say respected, fighting to be honoured as Khmer women. They had had their dignity trampled on by someone else, and they saw themselves as good Khmer women. How can someone do this to me? I'm not a bad girl. I'm not that. I am. They would fight it. They would fight it at the local level with the village chief. First of all, the families, the parents would try and work it out with the perpetrator, the village chief, the commune, the district level. Eventually, someone will get involved with the police and the referral to the NGO. But at no stage do I see her in this as a victim in that traditional sense. She is fighting for her recognition. The problem is when you're fighting for recognition as being a good Khmer woman, it isn't clear how you can be that once you've experienced sexual violence in a traditional culture. It's like, you know, it goes back to the cliche, right? The spoiled, you know, the white cloth once dropped on the ground is spoiled, right? Yeah, it's a cliche, but it comes back to that, really. Men are gold, women are cloth. If your cloth is dropped on the ground and it's stained, it's hard to clean it again. So this is hard though, right? Because we want to promote these rights. We want to get the perpetrator. We want to, you know. But you've got these tensions with, you know, balancing. Gee, I mean, these girls, most of them, they really couldn't stay. It's not for what I was seeing, and again, I'm working with pretty good organisations. They're not really having this stuff imposed on them, and some of them left earlier than what they were told, and they got in trouble and had difficulties because of it. They wanted an out because being there was unbearable for their families and for themselves. The honour, the dishonour and disrespect was unbearable, intolerable. All of the talk drove them insane.
Thanks for your presentation, Luke. Really, really interesting. Maybe a provocative question. I'm interested in your advice for practitioners, and I'm interested specifically in what you were saying before about how there's a greater ease potentially in finding community when women are attached to faith-based service providers. I'm wondering if your message is that it's actually harder to deliver an effective service if you're not a faith-based
No, that's not my message. But thanks for the question. Sorry, what was the first part? The first part, I got laughing and I forget what you started with there.
Your advice to practitioners.
Advice to practitioners, that's right. Thank you. This gives me a chance to say something important.
Which is that the practitioners are the ones who are giving advice to me that I'm trying to share with you, really. Do you know what I mean? They are not being led by these juridical legal conceptions of reintegration. You know, they're being influenced by traditional ideas. That's affecting some of the service delivery. But really, what I see emerging from the field is an inspirational idea of justice. Reintegration, what's the emphasis? It's about each other. It's about us participating in social groups and communities. It reminds us that rights on their own are not enough. Rights goes beyond. It goes into social life. Justice is dependent upon our interactions with people and the social norms that guide those interactions. And I'm drawing from Axel Honneth there when I speak about that. But justice, yeah, this idea of integration is coming from the field, the emphasis on it. It's a little bit confused coming from the field because sometimes we're thinking traditional, sometimes we're thinking sort of modern. We don't, you know, it hasn't been clarified so well. But the emphasis, the practitioners know it's about, you know, sometimes they might talk about belonging, or they talk about love, or, you know, they talk about, I remember when I used to do child protection work in Melbourne, we would say to each other with the hardest kids we had, you know, because the harder they get, the more money you've got to look after them, right? We've got all the money, we could give them anything in the world, but nothing that they need. You know? All of the money and everything you splash at it is not going to fix it. All of the things, even skills and abilities, you can give skills and abilities on their own, that's not enough. They need people, groups and institutions to welcome them in, where they can recognise and be recognised.
Luke, you just touched on the idea of throwing money at a problem. And it's not a luxury that we have in Cambodia or in many countries these days with economic recessions. So, probably a leap of faith beyond the research, but given these constrained economic times, and given that organisations who are working in reintegration have got to be smarter, more efficient, provide greater value for money, is there any broad advice that you can give to them as to how to fine-tune or refine their programs? You know, given the limited money, where would it best be spent?
a really good question. With the most difficult cases, and that's what this research focused on, it's really hard to do anything cheap. People who are brutalised are completely brutalised, and that's why they need so much help. With other sort of levels of care, you know, there's not as much need for the intensity, but at the most intense end, it's resource expensive, it's difficult. Yeah. How would money be well spent? I mean, for me, I'm obviously interested in seeing us look at what's going on and how social integration is achieved and develop benchmarks related to that. That's a good place, rather than just doing what we think. Neoliberal sort of agenda would have us put more emphasis on communities anyway, right? So this is a popular idea of having the communities take more responsibility rather than institutions. But I mean, there is evidence people live in communities. You know, they can't live in institutions. So yeah, there's definitely there's place for investment in the right ways to achieve better outcomes.
So can I build on that one and ask, in your research with the organisations, did you find any that you talked about one that almost stayed with the beneficiary all the way through and repeatedly visited them, but did you find any at the opposite end of the spectrum which were doing this in a relatively short space of time and quite smartly, for instance by sequencing things more tightly or involving the family at an earlier stage or doing anything like that to actually make this a shorter, perhaps even a cheaper process?
Yeah. Thank you. It's a good question. I was working with organisations who were doing mostly intensive work. It wasn't really quick, and there are some groups I've heard of who their approach is less resource intensive immediately following, and they're just trying to put this is specific to situations of rape within a community, just trying to put the minimum in to support that family to get through it without sort of bringing a whole lot of cultural baggage and counselling and everything from Western ideas, right? But just trying to minimally support that. That is, I mean, for me, that probably makes a bit of sense, because you got, if she can be accepted back, if people don't know, that's the best thing. She's going to be okay if she can individually get through it. Yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky. Case by case, individual. Yeah. Don't feel rude if you're leaving, please. I'm sick of it.
Yeah, please.
First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. It rang up quite a lot of bells for me. I managed a young people's service in England, in a northern city in England, and there is national trafficking of indigenous young girls who perhaps wouldn't be considered the bonniest lass, you know, not the best looking girl at school, and we're talking very young kids here. Because the people who are perpetrating the internal trafficker, you know, driving these kids to other cities, you know, in the Midlands, wherever, to have, to do what, you know, obviously. And these kids, you know, you look at these young women and you think, crikey, you know, their self-esteem is so low that actually they're, you know, stood there with this beautiful young non-indigenous man saying he loves her very, very much, and he's topping up her phone, and, you know, he's giving her bits and bobs in the way of gifts, and then he's, you know, taking photographs, and once photographs are taken, it's out there for the rest of that young person's like, shockingly so. So it's very much about two things really, I think. One, the youth services were talking about this for 2 years, loud and clear, for 2 years prior to anything being done about it. And that was because there was an anxiety of possibly being seen as racist, you know? So it was a hot potato not everybody wanted to touch. And I just wonder if there's been any constraints around that. And the response was 2 years too late, but was, a big crackdown, and a lot of these guys were picked up along with their friends, and, all the mapping was done of the different cities they've made, inroads out within Britain. And, it's not just a third world, problem. It's young women feeling uncared for and unappreciated and no esteem, and if you can comment on that, it's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Where there is a lack of recognition, then bad, negative recognition, people can go after that. Do you know what I mean? If you've got no one who really recognises you properly and well, then sometimes even the abuse and the violence against you at least acknowledges your existence. This is, yeah, absolutely. It's tragic.
Did you come across any barriers in the same way as youth services in England were being challenged not to report, really, in many ways, because it wasn't getting anywhere, it wasn't going anywhere?
Challenges to reporting instances of violence. Yeah, well, the most troubling one for the young women, right, is whether to report and seek criminal justice at the expense of their reputation if people don't know. This is the most personal, difficult problem that they face.
Yes.
Certainly, we shouldn't impose it on them. They make the decision. It's their right. You've got to support them. It's great, but it's a very, very difficult road, and the criminal justice outcomes are not so great often. I think I'm going to let everyone go. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate you.